An excellent and moving performance. It was really very moving for all of us. So this is a really excellent example of the work that can be carried out when an idea and value such as education and inclusion are brought together so harmoniously. We continue now with the opening ceremony. On all scientific and academic events have a keynote address. And it's an honor for us to be able to open the 13th International Congress of Educating Cities with a keynote address by Dr. Pablo Gentili, which will be introduced by Miquel Martinez, the co-director of the Scientific Committee for the Congress. You have the floor.
Bon dia a tothom. Buenos días.
Good morning. We're going to have the keynote address now. Pablo Gentili was kind enough to accept our request, and I'm going to just give a very brief introduction, and we'll hand over then to our special guest for him to be able to give some further food for thought for this Congress. As we heard earlier, in 1990, the whole movement got underway in Barcelona, and it's come full circle right back. And over those years, that's when really the very concept of the educating city has been developed. Gentili has worked on the idea of the educating city with people who really educate and train, something that goes right into the heart of everyday life, citizenship, and local government, as we've also heard. And this notion of the educating city is something that has grown and evolved over the years. We still have a lot to achieve in educating cities, although many of the experiences that we've seen are an indication of the way forward. But I think there are some conclusions that are important to bear in mind right now. And based on these conclusions, and Pablo Gentili's speech will be able to reflect further. An educating city needs a lot of educational resources. Schools need that, obviously, but educating cities can't just be theme parks of learning resources. They also need spaces where we can learn to feel recognized. An educating city needs spaces where people feel that they have rights and that their feelings are recognized. An educating city is a city that has to make rights available for everybody and that has to involve everybody in its very building. An educating city is something that, as we've heard over the various congresses that we've had, an educating city also requires, in addition to spaces for participation and declarations in favor of it, needs active, proactive policies that really make this biome of equality and diversity possible and contribute to more democracy and more equality and freedom for citizens. We need specific actions that give rights to the city to everyone, particularly the young, and in terms of health and welfare. And these are some of the things that Pablo Gentili is going to tell us about. Moving forward to towards a more inclusive society, a city that includes, entails working on recognition, collaboration, participation, and exercising of responsibility on the part of all citizens. It's perhaps truer than ever that although we firmly believe in the need to improve the conditions of cities, to make them educating cities, it's possibly truer than ever that a city that continues fighting for this, sometimes with tension between objectives and goals, and also inequalities that exist. There's a tension between the pursuit of equality as the end goal and also the continuance of inequalities that the system and certain policies allow to continue. So Pablo Gentili is going to talk about certain types of exclusion, of when rights are refused and denied in these complex societies that we live in, where sometimes, all too often, there are situations that are maybe unexpected or not, but situations that generate too little welfare and too little recognition and feeling of belonging. This is the road that we have to move down, although we have made success in other areas. And this is why we particularly asked Pablo to talk today. I'm not going to read his CV out. He's very well known, Dr. Gentili. Just I'm going to highlight a couple of salient points. He's academically involved and has been for a long time in the university in Rio de Janeiro. He's the executive secretary right now of the Latin American Board for Sciences, CLACSO. He's also an activist. He's been directly involved and has put into practice many of his theories. Many people have followed his theories, but he's actually put them into practice. He is involved in the World Social Forum and is renowned among us and internationally for his clarity, his sincerity, and his affability. He's as a person who really does what he says he will. Thank you very much, Dr. Gentili, for being with us. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you also to the organizers of this very important Congress for your invitation to talk at this very important moment. I celebrate and congratulate the association on its 20th anniversary. And this very open, plural, welcoming, diverse society of Catalonia, I'd like to thank them for hosting us at this very special time in the region's history. For those of us who have come from abroad, it's a great opportunity to really get a feel of what the democratic process is all about here.
Creo que todos los que venimos de afuera tenemos una gran oportunidad que es.
I think it's a great chance for us to learn here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come. Thank the Mayor, Jordi Martí, the Councillor Ángel Castiñera, Miquel Martínez, Antonio Hernández, and all of those who are behind the organization of the event. I'd like to start with a little story. I do apologize if you've heard it from me already. There are other stories that I've told more. This is one of them. But when I was preparing this Congress, this story really came to mind. So I wanted to tell you about it. Something that happened a few years ago. One Sunday morning, I was still asleep. I was just starting to wake up, and I saw that my bedroom window, Mateo, my son, and Felipe, a friend of his. Felipe is a son of the doorman and a cleaner who live near me, and they was having a chat at the window there, and Felipe was saying to Mateo, Biligar is a great place to live. Biligar, it's a favela in Rio de Janeiro, which is on one of the most beautiful hills in the city with fantastic views. And it's a favela that started to rise in the 40s. There's a little square just at the bottom of the hill, and in 1968 they started to build one of the first five-star hotels in Rio, and everybody was very excited about that, and the people thought that the building of this hotel would lead to urban development around the hotel. But actually what happened was that when the hotel was being built, and many of the builders started to live in the shanty town around the hotel. And what happened was that actually the favela developed, and it started to grow, and particularly in the 1980s. So it was a huge contrast between this five-star hotel with all of its luxury there on the one side, and on the other, one of the most populated favelas in Rio, which has a population of over 30,000. So Felipe was saying to Mateo, Vilagar is a great place. And Mateo was saying, really? Is it not dangerous? And he said, no, it's not dangerous at all. This, by the way, was before the favela pacification process, in which there was a lot of violence, obviously, as a cause of drugs and crime. But Felipe was saying, no, there are schools, you can do English classes, you can do theatre courses. There's even a football stadium. It's just a bit smaller than Maracanã Stadium. Doesn't have seating and all of that, but they have football championships every Sunday. And so Mateo would ask questions, and Felipe would say yes, absolutely, to convincing him of how great it was. And he said, look, I'll tell you what my dad says, Mateo. If Vilagar wasn't a good place to live, do you think they would have built a five-star hotel there?
La imagen me parece bastante elocuente porque
I think it's an eloquent image because it shows the process that Rio has undergone, like other Latin American cities. And it's all about these contrasts. Sometimes we talk about it as a divided city, but it's not divided in two. It's very fragmented, and contrasts are very clearly seen from the top to the bottom in these cities, like many other cities. Perhaps in Rio, the interesting element is that it's at the bottom of the city where the rich live, and it's up high where the favelas are, where the poorest people live, popular communities, and the favelas. I'd like to talk a little bit about the complex relationship between exclusion and inclusion dynamics in our cities. I don't think we should see this as a static, closed dynamic. There's a very porous process. As I say, it's very complex, the way these inclusion and exclusion dynamics are established, which is always a bit like a tug of war, if you like, but they really shape our contemporary cities, particularly in Latin America. I'm going to talk more about Latin America, but I'm sure this could be applied to many other continents and regions around the world. When I was thinking about telling you that little initial story, I've had exchanges with Antonia, Mikel, and other colleagues, and I realized that a special monograph had been organized for this Congress, and it's being launched here at the Congress, and that focuses on citizenship, inclusion, cities inclusion, and education. I was delighted, but also scared about that, because this monograph, which has a prologue by one of the great Catalan academics, will be very important. And I hope I'm not going to repeat the ideas that are presented in greater depth. in this book. So I asked them to send it to me, and when I read it, I saw there was a lot of interviews, Camila Croth and many others, and some of the fundamental texts in that I'd like to refer to, because they very eloquently sum up some of the ideas that I wanted to talk about today, particularly Saskia Sassin, Loic Waffen, King Brugué, from here in Barcelona, and Ana Falú, an Argentinian researcher, and they analyze inclusion and exclusion dynamics. Loic Waffen has written an article on this, and it's an update on some of the theories that he has defended, and it helps us to think about the dialects of marginalization and stigmatization in our cities. Waffen has really helped to analyze processes of fragmentation that are typical of modern urbanization. And he uses three main concepts that I think are excellent to understand the dynamic of Latin American societies and many other places in the world. He says that there are specific experiences in US and in Europe. In the US, there were ghettos, particularly marked by racial discrimination, black and white communities, unskilled workers and qualified workers, these huge big groups of low-skilled workers who offered services to industrial societies. But ghettos also are a broad network of social institutions that generate basic levels of welfare within the ghetto, although these ghettos are very different to the rest of the city and are excluded. And Waffen has said there's a difference between US urban ghettos and what he calls the anti-ghettos, the banlieue, as they're known in Paris, where the borders are much more porous and where there's a complex combination, very specific mixing of groups that have very different social origins, so immigrants and locals. So a kind of integration process. And although there are differences, these differences can lead to racism and xenophobia. Not just in richer swathes of society, but also in poorer parts. But they don't work in the same way as American ghettos. Waffen said that with the crisis and this very radical market economy and the crisis of the social state, in the 60s and 70s, American ghettos went into crisis. There was an implosive process which led to what he calls anti-ghettos. And this was when these ghettos really suffered twofold exclusion on grounds of race and class. I think Waffen's ideas are very interesting. In Latin America, we've seen all of this, all mixed up. In the last 10 or 20 years, in Latin America, we've gone from these anti-ghettos, these very excluded, isolated, closed parts of the city, to ghettos, so cities within cities, but that are far more integrated, that have association networks and cooperation, and with more presence of the state, particularly in the last decade. With public policies, as we know, have generated social protection networks and have managed to offset or at least curtail the effects of disintegration and social exclusion that are typical in neoliberal regimes. So obviously we have to look at this more closely, but unlike the US, where ghettos became anti-ghettos, as Wakwan says, what we've seen in Latin America is that anti-ghettos have become ghettos, or even hyper-ghettos have become ghettos, and these are all existing side by side in the same city with very open, porous boundaries. Anyway, beyond those three concepts of anti-ghetto, ghetto and hyper-ghetto, Wakwan's ideas are very interesting, because in all urban marginalization, there is a strong dynamic of stigmatization. Exclusion is like a stamp, if you like, a label. It's something that defines the people, and usually in a way that is disparaging and humiliating. And so people who live in that kind of space, like favelas, people who live in the type of shanty towns in Chile with their various names, in Peru, in all of these other Central American countries as well. It marks them and labels them as the root of all evil in all cities. So any problem that takes place, drugs, violence, marginality, citizen security, are all put down to the people who live in these ghettos, anti-ghettos, or hyper-ghettos. And these are spaces that have started to multiply. People who live there who are in no way a minority. In fact, minorities are people who live in other areas in our cities that also identify the city but are made up by middle and upper classes. As I say, these areas aren't minorities, but they're socially weakened and politically marginalized, according to Wakwan. In any event, I think it's interesting to understand how this change, this categorization of ghetto, anti-ghetto, and hyper-ghetto, it helps us to understand how the borders between inclusion and exclusion have shifted and metamorphosized, although some of the fundamental characteristics have remained the same. Another great researcher, Mike Day from the US, uses the concept of a favela to talk about all of these different types of shanty towns that have different names in different countries. So, as I say, I'm going to refer to them all with the name of favela. So, back David's text tells us how over the first half of the 20th century, particularly the start of the 21st century, the urbanization processes were intensified. And as he said, the future cities won't be the cities that we've seen in sci-fi, steel and glass cities sparkling. These will be marginalized spaces in the city. Cities will be made up of huge spaces of agglomeration, conglomeration, and confusion of favelas and urban marginalized areas due to the huge attraction of urban development in today's world, which is linked to the need for survival in times of crisis, which are being compounded given neoliberal conservative public policies. David's text is not very optimistic, but it's based on data. For example, in China, almost 40% of the country, one of the countries with greatest economic growth, lives in favelas. In India, it's over 55%, Brazil, 35%. In Nigeria, 80%. In Mexico, just over 20%. And obviously in countries like Ethiopia, Tanzania, many African countries, that figure is over 90%. People who live in this type of poor, marginalized, stigmatized shanty town, or as Davis says, favela planet. Obviously, many of these groups live in Caracas, Bogota, Lima, and also in Brazil. It's interesting that the association's monograph that I've talked about also contains a text that is very illustrative of the inclusion-exclusion process and how it's becoming more and more complex. And that's by Saskia Sassin.
Sassin has a text which recovers some of his other publications, in particular some of the chapters on sociology of globalization, which I would strongly recommend you read. Sassin establishes a relationship between dynamics of centralization and marginalization in the cities. This geography of centrality and marginalization is modified, or becomes modified, and Sassin, unlike some of the other approaches of Davis and Raquand, is a bit more hopeful, because in this question of capacity of the city, he draws our attention to a dynamic of resistance, of capillarity, of struggles and mobilizations, which allows the city to be less deterministic, or space of the city less deterministic, as highlighted by the other two speakers in terms of poverty, deprivation. Sassin says that cities are complex, cities give possibilities of creation, of creativity, which looks at these three main features and makes a contribution to use creative elements which exist in the city, and not just reproductive structures of violence. But this more optimistic approach by Sassin does have certain riders. There are threats in our cities to large deurbanization processes. The concept of deurbanization, and I do not wish to criticize Sassin in that respect, one of the great contemporary sociologists, this concept nonetheless does puzzle me a bit, because in Latin America, the process of deurbanization in the second part of the 20th century, in the first years of our century, have been the features of urbanization. There's been no de-urbanization, there's been urbanization, but this is terminology, you needn't worry about that. The key processes which threaten our cities, according to Sassin, threaten to de-urbanize cities, are inequality, privatization, violence, and supervisory or monitoring systems. Put in a Latin American context, some of these features could be de-urbanizing or re-urbanizing. In any case, these trends are worrying, and yet at the same time they show us how there's a metamorphosis of processes of inclusion and exclusion in our cities. For instance, in Latin America, in the last decade, we saw the progress, significant progress, of struggles against poverty. Poverty has been reduced largely in the main urban centers in our continent. There are some exceptions to the rule. But if we observe levels of poverty in large cities in Latin America in the 80s and 90s, and we compare them with levels of poverty today, we will observe that in Latin America, unlike the process in certain European countries, even the United States or in Spain, in Greece, Iceland, France, or in the United Kingdom, in our countries, poverty did diminish rather than increase in the last decade. In some cases, it has diminished dramatically. In the case of Brazil, which has in little more than a decade, has cut back poverty to the tune of 40 million people have been dragged out of poverty. Just think of that. What it means dragging 40 million human beings out of conditions of extreme poverty in a decade when there was a massive economic crisis in the world. So Latin America is a dramatic case. The economic crisis generated multiplied poverty in the whole world, but in Latin America, despite this economic crisis, levels of poverty in large cities dropped, decreased. I don't wish to bore you with data, but in 2002, 49.3% or 49.9% of Latin American population were below the line of poverty, the poverty line. When we saw a boost in neoliberal poverties, liberalistic policies, but now this figure has dropped to 27%. We moved from almost 50% to almost 25% in a decade, which means that policies to combat poverty, which had as main target rural population, benefited urban population to a large degree. The results have been impressive. Nonetheless, there's no doubt, we must recognize that levels of inequality along these years did not diminish as significantly. Latin America continues, despite not being the poorest area in the planet, is certainly the continent with the greatest level of disequality, of inequality, even though inequality is beginning slowly to diminish, the inequality gap, say, at a much slower rhythm than the decrease in poverty. But except in main cities in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and other countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, not just in the so-called post-neoliberal countries, but also in countries which today do not have progressive, so-called progressive governments, have seen decreases in poverty. An example, case in point, is Colombia. So despite whatever the political color of a country is, the drop in poverty across the board in Latin America has been dramatic, but not inequality. In certain countries, even inequality has increased in the last few years. What does all this mean in terms of the urban configuration? Well, we historically assumed from certain academic paradigms that a drop in poverty could generate a greater porosity, a greater openness, a greater democratization of urban spaces. And in that sense, the drop in poverty would generate greater integration of the poorer neighborhoods, a greater interaction between the more impoverished neighborhoods and other districts or other neighbors. What has happened in the last decade is not exactly that. We have seen the persistence of a process of separation or marginalization in a context where those who live in their spaces are no longer as poor as they used to be, but the persistence of inequality means that differences are maintained almost unaltered. And the sectors, in inverted commas, more integrated the city, where you have the sort of the middle or high, upper middle class population lives, move away and still stigmatize those who are poor with threats and crime. So in Latin America, poverty did drop, did diminish. Inequality, nonetheless, was maintained. And process of segmentation and urban separation, as mentioned by Sassen and Vaughan, have actually increased in the last few years, paradoxically. It's a process of concentration of wealth, which is impressive. This did not happen in Latin America. It happened in many other continents, in the main, more developed countries as well. We have seen this trend in concentration of wealth. Think, and this is one of the contributions mentioned by that fantastic book Piketty called Capital in the 21st Century, which indicates how the development of our cities maintains patterns of production and reproduction which give rise to deep inequality. In the world today, 83% of the world population has less than 10% of the world's wealth, while 16% of the population concentrate almost 91% of the world's wealth. So 4,300 million people have less than 10% of wealth, and the remainder has 83%. Processes borne out by different studies, not just by progressive academics, but reports by the World Bank or by Credit Suisse, which is one of the banks which carries out very significant studies on poverty and wealth in the world, and the contribution of UNESCO, UNICEF, and so on, bear out that this process of concentration is increasing in our countries, both in the first and the third world, and this concentration of wealth and greater inequality is one of the main features of these processes of stigmatization and exclusion, which, going back to Latin America, has the specificity that there are less poverty-struck inhabitants, but that does not mean that the wealthy are not getting wealthier. This monogram has a very interesting text by an Argentinian writer who talks about the experience in Rosario. It's a certain consideration which are very, very important concerning how there is a persistence in this social production of our city. There are mechanisms of exclusion and inequality which are very deep-seated and which has their main victims certain sections of the population, women in particular. This is the key tenet of Ana Falú and the writer from Rosario. But in this context of reduction of poverty and increasing inequality, there are great obstacles, not just by women, but by other sections of the population, indigenous peoples, blacks, and so on. In the case of women, it's one of those symptomatic, as Ana Falú clearly bears out in her texts and her publications. We also have mentioned some of our texts this particularity of Latin American society. Latin American society has become a lot more democratic in the last few years, undoubtedly. But they are democracies where rights which are historically denied are coming out to the fore, but there is still massive gender discrimination, which means that women in Latin America are much closer to the presidents of the Republic than certain key rights. We has the area of the world with the most women presidents, but we're the region of the world where there are still very high levels of gender violence, and the fact that many women cannot access key basic rights, culture, education, power, and we have a reproduction of the patriarchal and patrimonial relationship, which means our society has become democratized at the top, but not at the grassroots, which means that this inequality of gender is one of the main structural features of our contemporary cities. This is also reflected in the schooling system, because our cities and our societies have become less poor, as I've said before, and this means that sectors we previously excluded from education have joined the mainstream educational system. Previously, in our cities, the process of marginalization and deprivation coincided with processes of educational exclusion, school failure. Those who were poor lived in shanty towns of various denominations, but living in those spaces, they could not access basic services concerning health or education. They were confined, and many rights were denied to them. In the last few years, the poor can actually join the mainstream school system, and the levels of schooling in Latin America are growing, and there's a high level of universality, almost as in Europe. In Latin America, there are certain specific features with levels of schooling of 115%, which may surprise you. 15% more kids in school than kids which really exist. So almost like the multiplication of bread and fish, isn't it? You may say to yourself. There's a great mobility between cities, which means there's great mobility in terms of schoolroom attendance. So kids will join a school, leave it, but they'll still be accounted for in statistics, right? Due to these rather contradictions. The fact that many funding policies are associated to kids remaining in school, many sort of like subsidy policies mean that schools wish to show that there's a high attendance level. And their sort of income transfer policies, universal grants linked to families or children, the famous Bolsa Familia in Brazil, the family grant. Well, these processes of funding transfer are conditioned to kids going to school and kids reaching health, getting health treatment, going to health clinics. But anyway, whatever. More and more kids, children are joining the mainstream educational system in Latin America. And our cities are more democratic from the educational point of view. And yet, this geography of centralization and marginalization continues reproducing itself in the school system, within the classroom, because in the large cities, there is no city educational system. You have educational segments and circuits which are at considerable variance. In one same neighborhood, you have very different kinds of schools. And this differentiation and like this kind of walls between different schools is a key feature. Like I said, this is a trend which goes back to the 70s and 80s, but it has become more marked in the 90s and in particular in the last few years. To say that a child in the large Latin American city, and also this applies to Europe to a large extent, goes to school does not mean anything unless we say, well, what kind of school does he go to? The difference between my son Mateo and Felipe, the son of my janitor, occurred in Leblon, in the district of Leblon, which is in 1 mile. We have 5 or 6 types of different schools in Rio de Janeiro. The kids go to certain schools and will be able to reach the top universities of the world with higher levels of cognitive power. On the other hand, maybe next door, you have middle-class schools where kids attempt to survive, keep their head above water, and not fall into, if you like, the public school. Public schools, more integrated, and public schools which are, if you like, tickets for social exclusion. And all this within 1.5 miles. So therefore, what we call educational systems are products of an immense effort of imagination, of scientific fiction, to give, if you like, names which express a huge differential, and going back to Saskia Sassen's approach, process of centralization, decentralization, integration, and marginalization, which become more and more complex as the previous excluded due to poverty have access to school. But that does not always mean, as Camila Crosso also mentions in her interview in this monograph, does not lead to an effective widening of education rights for all. In particular, and this is interesting, because you, I'm sure, should be familiar with it, and if you're not, please read it. The last study carried out by UNICEF on child poverty in wealthy countries had an immense impact in Spain, because the child in Spain and many other countries of the first world, in the context of a massive economic recession, levels of child poverty shoot up, reaching in certain European countries, more developed European countries, almost 40% of children. 40% of girls and boys in countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece are approaching levels of child poverty in Latin America in the most dramatic moments of the neoliberal policies decades ago. So it's not just a problem of the third world. issue of the third world. We can see how levels of child poverty impact on the life chances of kids in a school system which is split in like sort of watertight compartments, as I have described. In this sense, are you hearing me? Well, the interpreters can certainly hear you loud and clear.
Esta nueva configuración, a mí me encanta.
I'm delighted when I see from the public two people chatting to each other, but it's very comfortable media here launching forth because sometimes if you're sitting in the row, well, you take your shoes off, take your socks off, and up here you can't do that. But from down there you can see everything I do. I think I lost my train of thought. Where was I? Oh yeah, levels of poverty. Levels of child poverty. And there's one subject which I've dwelt upon more than others, this process of de-urbanization and inequality. Well, this is something which is happening now, and this gives rise to a question. How much inequality can our cities withstand? How much inequality are they ready to stand? And how much inequality can subsist without social conflict and process of defragmentation and social or the breakup of social cohesion, if you like. The second dynamic of deurbanization, as mentioned by Sassen, and which we call reurbanization or anti-democratic reurbanization, is expansion of processes of privatization or privatization trends. Latin America is a good example, an emblematic example. Why? Let me tell you why. It's a good example in a social sense. When sociologists talk of a good example, they normally talk about a terrible case of point of increasing crime or misery and exclusion. A good positive example, in the best sense of the word, a good positive analysis. In Latin America, a lot of the privatization tendencies of the 90s have been reversed. Unlike Europe, in Latin America is not the area where there are most privatization tendencies. Rather, there's been a process of renationalization of public policy in a democratic sense. And this is very significant and very good for Latin America, of course. Nonetheless, there is a contradiction here between privatization and deprivatization. We have managed to increase the public dynamic or increase the public dynamicity of state policy, contemplating or thinking about public policies which are increasingly intense, and getting certain spaces of government policy and turning them into the public sphere or bring them back into the public sphere. But what we have not achieved, and there are exceptions, of course, there are many Latin American cities who are attempting to do this and have done it, such as Porto Alegre or Rosario in the last few years. I don't wish to mention many cities because those who feel excluded, those I don't mention will feel excluded. But these two examples are benchmarks, if you like, of recovery of what is public. Recovery of the public sphere. Porto Alegre in the last few years and Rosario more recently. Well, they are harbingers or examples that you can widen the public sphere in a city, but that's not what's most common. What is most common is that even in the context of national policies, of widening the public sphere, processes of privatization have increased paradoxically in our cities, not just by widening what Mike Davis calls the favela planet or the shantytown planet, or turning the wealthy areas into confined areas. We could also apply, although perhaps stretching the concept of ghetto or hyper-ghetto used by Wachman for the poor areas and the really wealthy districts, which are also ghettos. They live within their compound, but if they go beyond the compound, they feel threatened. They feel, if we move outside our golden cage, we'll be attacked. This outside area experienced as a threat confines them, and their compound is only 15%. And these wealthier sectors just stay in their ghetto. They go to malls, shopping centers, cinemas, all within the golden cage. Rio de Janeiro, half the population of Rio de Janeiro is black. If you go to any cinema, and I'm talking of Rio because it's a city where I live, a city which I love, but if you go to on a Saturday or Sunday to any cinema, film theater in Rio de Janeiro, where 70%, 5% of the population is black, I'm talking of San Corrado, Ipanema, you will hardly find more than 3 or 4% of black kids or black faces in the cinemas. Where's the remaining 60%? Progressive trend of privatization, this geography of benefits also has a negative impact on the cultural sphere. And while blacks stay in their confined areas, so do the wealthy population. But unfortunately, the poor people don't have that many cinemas. In fact, in many of our cities, cinemas have been turned either into evangelical churches or supermarkets. Better evangelical churches than supermarkets. In Buenos Aires, in Rivadavia, used to be a massive, huge, big cinema, which I remember from my childhood, with Argentina or sort of X movies, which are, but anyway, that's something else. It was known as the Roca Film Theater. Roca was a national hero in Argentina. It was purchased by an evangelical church, and now it's no longer Cines Roca, but Cristo es la Roca, which means Christ is a rock. This is what is happening in our cities. And these are the spaces where poor people go. So the cutback in supply of cultural facilities for the poor is an example of the privatization of cultural commodities in our cities. Another example of privatization in the educational field, where there's a multiplication of private schools, a big feature of our cities. Anyone goes to any Latin American capital or Caribbean capital, from the airport to the city center, you'll see dozens of private universities in garages, in small venues. The private university of the development of strategic thought for the new millennium, in a sort of 70 square meter venue. University for the development of educational competence in a world which changes. And every 100 meters, almost like chemists or pharmacists, you have private universities mushrooming. Almost 80% of students in universities in Brazil go to private universities, who are some of the most profitable businesses in Latin American cities. And they feature the urban space. Privatization of education in Latin America to provide for the poor in the private sector. Many of our private universities purchase the most accessible spaces closer to subways, to bus stations, to mass transit, and where you can find concentration of people after working, after offices or after office hours or working hours. So privatization has impacted on the urban geography, and including in many of our cities, the wealthy go to public universities, which are outside the city, and the poor study in private universities near to where they work. In this sense, we must recognize the immense risk of these privatization tendencies or trends. And as Kim Bruguet has mentioned in his text, he has borne out how these processes of privatization lead to a crisis of so-called regenerated democracy, which is based on direct participatory movements and a deliberative democracy. Processes of privatization limit spaces for encounter and urban citizens' participation, and this is deeply disturbing. Then we also have an intensification of processes of violence in our cities. And it's not for me to tell you about the levels of violence in other cities, not just in European cities, but also in Latin American cities. And for Latin Americans, this is something very severe, very disturbing, because we have managed to do certain things which previously were identified as the necessary steps to cut back violence. We have taken these steps, and yet levels of violence have not decreased. Violence was a product of poverty. We cut back poverty, but violence actually increased. It was said. They said to have a more active state with greater public intervention, which invested in social policies in the public sphere, invested more in education, would, if you like, decrease violence. We invested more in health and education, in public safety, and yet violence does not diminish. So, in this sense, this is one of the key issues key debates to understand this geography of centralization and exclusion which takes place in our cities, understanding how processes of violence take place in our large cities, and they basically attack one sector of the population, the poorest, who are the main victims of violence. I'm not going to give you data of Brazil, but the inventory of violence is common to the whole of Latin America.
In every 10 minutes there is a murder in Brazil, and in under half an hour a young black person aged between 15 and 24 dies from murder in Brazil. More than 33,000 deaths from homicide in Brazil every year. Over 50,000 rapes reported. And we know that the rate of rape reporting is relatively low, particularly in poorer communities. Black people, young people are also have the highest rate of prison population. Violence, though, and I'm coming to my conclusion here, violence also occurs in difficulties in public policies in managing citizen security. Between 2009 and 2012, just over 11,000 people died, most of whom were under the age of 24. 11,197 people died in that period. In between 1982 and 2012, 11,000 people died in the US. So that was 30 years. The American police killed the same number of people in the US as the Brazilian police had killed in Brazil in just 3 years. So in this process of producing and multiplying violence, this is very clear. A couple of studies have just been published in Brazil of great relevance. One is a map of violence. I need to look at my notes here. I just have a few more points to make before finishing. And I am supposed to be sticking to the time. So 2 important studies, a map of violence done by CLACSO and the Forum on Public Safety in Brazil. Very important reports, those. So what can we do in light of all of this? I think the work and experiences that will be presented at this Congress are a huge opportunity and great potential to think about ways out and ways forward from these situations. Matteo and Felipe didn't meet at school. They met on the street. Perhaps it's not the best space for that type of meeting between the haves and the have-nots. Educating cities that are underpinned by the possibility of increasing and multiplying opportunities, educating cities that foster the right and access to education and public school as a fundamental right. This is where the haves and the have-nots come together in one large urban space. It's not just in education or in the school. There are other places. There are other urban facilities that are just as important as the school. In Latin America, many schools have started to develop these. For example, centers for memory which should also be meeting places, places where people can come together and look at a memory of the past, present, and future of our societies. Cities like Santiago, Buenos Aires, Medellin, and others in Mexico. These are exceptional cities because a modern society has created these spaces for people to live together, this kind of utopia in what they call public schools. Educating cities with this type of public school are the vital condition to create, the vital precondition to create this inclusion that we seek. So we started with this exciting and moving performance by the Pablo Picasso School from here in Barcelona. That's not from one of the richest neighborhoods in Barcelona. It's a fairly working class neighborhood. But we saw in their show the collective interest that they had in doing this show all together. It's interesting to see that we can recognize the importance of a dance show like this in a school. And it's really important to bring that off, that everybody works together and everybody supports each other. If one boy or one girl had fallen in the middle of that show, they would all have fallen. They would all have got together and tried to carry it off and keep the show going and to make this show an opportunity for growth and collective construction. That doesn't happen in a maths class or in science or in history, where schools really contribute to the survival of the fittest and competition. We need then public schools that have values of differences, of the crowd, a space for diversity, and showing that by coming together we all grow. And I hope that that is the type of space where Matteo and Felipe will one day be able to come together. Thank you very much.